Welcome to the Outthinking Investor. I'm Daleep Singh. There's a concept in military strategy called escalation dominance. The idea is that the side that controls the pace and the pain of a conflict determines the outcome. For most of the Cold War era, the United States had escalation dominance, militarily, technologically, and also in the arena of economics. America controlled the financial rails, the technology stack, and the trading system that every economy depended on. America wrote the rules and shaped the institutions that policed them. And if America wanted to use economic power as a weapon against any other country, it could, though it rarely did so. America held that option. Other countries mostly didn't. That era is over, and the U.S. China summit is one of the clearest windows, in my view, that we've gotten into what comes next. The summit went on for 43 or so hours. There was a tour of Zhongnanhai, the inner sanctum. There was a dinner at the Temple of Heaven. There was a new bilateral framework, constructive strategic stability, that Beijing is describing as an agreement binding not just on this administration, but also successor U.S. administrations. There were modest commitments on agricultural purchases and aircraft, and there were AI talks that both sides described quite differently. And then 4 days after the Americans left town, Vladimir Putin arrived, and he left with over 40 signed cooperation agreements, a joint declaration of a multipolar world, and President Xi warning of unilateral and hegemonic countercurrents running rampant. So financial markets have read these events as stabilizing. The temperature is reduced, catastrophic risk dialed down, and a relationship that was dangerously tense now being managed towards peaceful coexistence. That reading isn't wrong, at least not entirely wrong, but it's certainly not complete. There are a deeper set of takeaways that I think investors and observers need to absorb. Beijing came into the summit with a clear theory of the competition, and it's not a secret. It shows up in their official documents, public essays that China's intel officials have written. And the argument goes something like this: America is in structural decline. The window of China's ascendancy is open. And the task of Chinese statecraft is not to provoke, it's to buy time and to build capabilities, while Washington exhausts itself from within with social cleavages, fiscal profligacy, and political dysfunction. That, to me, was the strategic backdrop for what went down in Beijing. My guest today is Julian Gewirtz, a prolific historian of China, my former colleague at the White House. He was senior director for China and Taiwan Affairs, which means he owned the China file at the highest level of the U.S. government. And, Julian, being a scholar and a practitioner, means he's a student of the long game that's being played. Not just what was said at the summit, but where this competition is headed and what it means for global stability. Julian, thanks for being on the Outthinking Investor.
Thanks so much, Daleep. It's great to be with you.
So I want to start with recent history. The day before the summit, you published an essay in the New York Times. You wrote that Xi's ultimate goal is not to stabilize the relationship with America. It's to build a different world order with China at the center. And to understand these objectives, you point to a 90-year-old text from Mao on protracted war. Required reading, you argued, because the logic from Mao's piece maps almost perfectly to today. And it's been referenced repeatedly by Chinese state media and President Xi himself. And Mao wrote that struggle plays out in stages. First, a defensive stage when the adversary is stronger, then a period of stalemate when the forces are more evenly matched, and finally an opportunity for a counteroffensive that produces ultimate victory. So with that framing in mind, you predicted a stalemate at the summit. Beijing would buy time. America would go home satisfied with modest commitments, and none of the hard issues would get resolved. How did that prediction hold up?
Thanks so much. And, for me as a historian and a policymaker, we sometimes think about the Chinese leadership as, you hear phrases like a black box or it's, impossible, inscrutable. But candidly, I think they are far more open about their framing and their ambitions than that gives them credit for. And the challenge for analysts around the world, including in the United States, is to figure out how to interpret and parse the signals that they're sending. And so that was really my effort with this essay and the use of Mao's On Protracted War, which of course he wrote in the context of the war against Japan. China's sort of that's the front in the global war we call World War II, which China calls the War of Resistance. And Mao's core point, which you just summarized there, is something that we see Chinese leaders, Xi Jinping on down, referring to indirectly often and sometimes directly. Candidly, I've been calling this a stalemate summit because it is occurring in an environment where Beijing believes that, as you said in your introduction, time is on its side. The correlation of forces favor China in its view over the long term. And in the more recent past, over the last 18 months, Beijing has moved from its longtime strategy of playing defense vis-a-vis the United States, feeling the United States was pressing up against China's interests and that they were simply able to fend that off, to, over the course of last year's escalation, really developing a capability and deploying that capability to push back and to show the United States that it, in fact, can, that China can push back in a meaningful way that caused President Trump to drop his tariffs. Mm-hmm. I'll just say one final thing on the Mao essay, which is, I felt a little bit like, whenever you publish an essay like that, it's predictive, you're going out on a limb. I have been very struck over the past week by the fact that the whispers here and there that I pointed to in various textual sources about the resonance of On Protracted War, Mao's essay, for contemporary China, has gone from being something where, I was going back and forth with my editor, making sure that there was all the evidence that I wanted to marshal, to now it's ubiquitous. It's actually really remarkable. Kicker, the Chinese Ministry of State Security linked think tank, which is perhaps the most influential agenda-setting think tank on the foreign policy side, published an extremely lengthy essay, which I'm writing a new piece on now, which centers the entire essay on this idea of strategic stalemate taken from On Protracted War, and a number of other analysts have done the same.
Julian, just unpack for us, what is the value from Beijing's perspective of buying time? Why does it think that time will accrue more favorably to Beijing than to Washington?
Yeah, this is, to me, the center of U.S. China competition from a strategic framing perspective. Beijing, as you alluded to, believes that the United States is in a structural process of decline, that for both domestic and international reasons, a multipolar world, a world that is not centered on the United States, is coming into being, and that the United States still has strengths, but that over the longer term, it is weakening structurally. And by contrast, China's rise is inevitable, that the correlation of forces, again, domestically and internationally, favors the emergence of China as a central and autonomous pole, if not the most significant pole in the future international order. So from that perspective, when Beijing says its goal is to buy time, it is not simply about developing its economy further. For a long time, China has had a buying time approach, really about building up its strengths, having a stable international environment so that it could focus on economic development at home. But this version of stability that it is seeking now, this version of buying time that it is seeking now, is much more about waiting out a power transition, doing what it can to make that power transition happen in a way that is favorable to China, minimally disruptive to China, but that projects forward 10 or 15 years and sees China achieving its objectives, of becoming the world's leading power.
Okay, so understood. The stalemate summit, in the way that you described, served Beijing's purposes. But that then raises a harder question. What should Washington's posture actually be? Because, there are two serious schools of thought. I think neither are especially partisan. One school of thought is that a cold peace is good enough. The objective would be prevent deterioration, manage the competition within acceptable limits. The second school of thought would say hard deterrence and maybe escalation dominance. Those are the prerequisites for stability. In other words, warm atmospherics without credible threats actually creates risk and reduces stability. Where do you come down on how Washington should respond to Beijing's efforts to buy time?
Let me first say, these are two very serious schools of thought, but I actually don't think either is what we are getting now. Meaning, there's a desire by some who do seek, period de-escalation and who seek a cold peace, which is a totally reasonable goal. Meaning, period of de-escalation is a good thing. It's not as if the KPI of U.S. China relations is escalation. A sensible détente would focus on, yes, reducing tension, but also centrally shoring up the strengths of the United States, both at home, our economy, but also our technological and scientific base and our capabilities there. And then internationally, our relationships with allies, our soft power, our sort of ability to remain a magnet for the world. That's the version of a détente that makes strategic sense. And that is not, of course, what we are seeing right now. And the irony that the United States would use a period of stability with Beijing to engage in, adventures elsewhere that are costly and decreasing our ability to deter China over the long term is, I don't think, anybody's idea of a coherent version of the cold peace argument. On the other hand, sorry, please, yeah.
No, go ahead, Julian, because I want to come back to this question of cold peace in terms of what are the acceptable limits within a cold peace. But go ahead, and I'll come back to it.
On the other hand, I think it's pretty clear right now that while the United States has leverage vis-a-vis China, whether it's the dominance of U.S. and allied firms in the semiconductor ecosystem, or the enduring dominance of the U.S. dollar, which, as you know better than I do, can be deployed in any number of ways, that the paradigm of that kind of deterrence focus on China is just not where this administration is. And doing the two of these tracks together, I think, is the ideal route for policy, meaning understanding one's meaningful leverage, deterring Beijing effectively, but also working to have significant and meaningful channels of communication that can lower tension and avoid the risk of inadvertent escalation. That's the ideal approach. It's not simply a Goldilocks solution. It is possible, but instead we're kind of getting 0 for 2 rather than 2 for 2.
Understood. So you don't see the different schools of thought as necessarily being in conflict. But if you have a cold peace without building capabilities, you're producing vulnerability.
Precisely.
And I want to. There was a story coming out of Beijing that I think's been underreported, which is the framework that Beijing has used to describe the relationship, which is constructive strategic stability. And China's foreign minister, Wang Yi, described it as providing strategic guidance for the next 3 years and beyond. And it seems to me that Wang Yi's bottom line is that both sides have to respect each other's core interests without defining what those interests are. But we know very well that China's core interest, as they see it, includes Taiwan, technology policy, and trade. And that means any future U.S. administration that raises tariffs, that tightens chip controls, or approves a major arms sale to Taiwan could find itself accused of violating a personal commitment made by the two heads of state in Beijing. Am I kind of reading too much into this?
No, I think you're spot on, Daleep. And I would just say a couple more things. One is, the dynamic that we were talking about earlier vis-a-vis buying time. When we think about what constructive strategic stability means, it is a doctrine centered on the idea of an enduring period of stalemate in which China is continuing to work to buy time. And they, of course, want this period to last as long as possible because, as you were alluding to earlier, in many ways, it is quite favorable to them to have de-escalation and stability on terms similar to those that we've seen today. I just make one other point here, which is that from a U.S. interest perspective, the idea that the two heads of state talked about this, agreed to it, that it appeared in both readouts, is candidly, I think, not something that is terribly constraining in practice. And the question to my mind really is the administration in Washington able to continue to pursue core American interests, longstanding American interests, without really destabilizing the U.S. China dynamic in a way that they clearly want to avoid? I think that's totally achievable, but they have seemed quite anxious about that so far.
Yeah, so at a minimum, we have kind of a new form of improvisational ambiguity, not at all clear whether it's constructive. Okay, I want to just stay on the summit for one more question. There were two other items that investors, that markets really key on that were absent from the readouts. China's controls on rare earth exports and America's controls on AI chips. Those are among the most consequential economic levers in the relationship, but there was silence on those two items in the readouts. What does that tell you?
Well, I think each of those two tells us something slightly different. The absence of rare earths in the readout, I think, signals very little other than that Scott Bessent has more work to do. And he's been pretty clear that he's going to continue engaging with his Chinese counterpart, He Feng. And it seems likely that the period of truce or détente there, Beijing not imposing those controls in a systematic way, will last. Of course, as your listeners know, while some movement has happened during this period, it hasn't been perfect. It's clear Beijing continues to see rare earth exports as a leverage point. So, I think we should anticipate that there will be continued flows, but it will also continue to be tied up in U.S. China dynamics. And even at the firm level, some firms may get faster and better access than others, depending on Beijing's perception. So that's sort of, I think, not in the readout because it's an area for further negotiation, and Beijing didn't feel that it had to give on that in this summit, which is quite striking. On the export controls question in the U.S. side on advanced chips, obviously, as folks know, Jensen Huang, a late addition to the trip, hitched a flight in Alaska on Air Force One. And, I think there, Beijing has a clear policy direction, which is they do not want to become dependent or more dependent on NVIDIA, on foreign semiconductors, and that they want to push firms in China, Frontier Labs, other tech companies that would love to get access to those chips, that they want to push them to really double down on the indigenization path centered on Huawei. I don't expect that there will be perfect alignment around that because, as we know, there are a lot of different ways that these firms can get access to foreign compute, and they're trying hard to do that, whether it's sort of circumvention of export controls, overseas cloud, or even direct purchases. But I don't think there's been a meaningful shift in China's approach to this. The last point I'd say is just we are in a truly upside down moment on these issues where the sale of U.S. chips to China has gone from a year and a half ago being a profound leverage point for the United States vis-a-vis China to now the United States treating it as something that Beijing could do as a concession to us. I don't mean that in any way actually as a partisan point. I just mean it as we think about the balance of forces and of influence and of leverage. It is a true reversal, a true upside down moment, and something that, the strategists in Beijing, honestly, at some level must find slightly surprising because it exceeds even their expectations.
To level set with our listeners, in case anyone has not been following this very closely, Washington has approved H200 export licenses to China, I believe for 10 Chinese firms, including Alibaba, including Tencent. And Beijing has said no. Chinese customs officials have turned the chips away because the Chinese authorities have told their own technology companies, as you said, Julian, not to buy these chips unless it's absolutely necessary. Now, the NVIDIA H200 chip is one or two, maybe three steps behind where the frontier actually is today. But Huawei's own roadmap shows it won't produce anything matching the H200's capabilities until late 2027 at the earliest. So Beijing is refusing a chip. It's 2 years away from being able to build itself deliberately to force that domestic capability from developing, to force it to develop faster. It's striking.
Yeah, if I can just add one more thing, which might be of interest to folks, my perspective on this is we are seeing a really fascinating emerging fissure within the Chinese system, which sometimes we think of as a monolith. But in this case, it's very clear that the interests of of Chinese frontier labs and the Chinese government are different. The frontier labs in China want these chips. There's no doubt about that. They want the best in the world. They know that NVIDIA is the best in the world and would love to get a hold of them. And the Chinese government does not want them to do it. The points there to think about are, first, this debate over chips, which I've just alluded to, where the tensions, must be profound between these different actors. And obviously, not all Chinese corporations have the same interests here. Huawei, which is very influential in Beijing, would love for this policy, as the Chinese government is practicing it, to continue for a long time. But again, the frontier labs would like the foreign chips. But of course, we've also seen cases like the Manus Meta roll-up unrolling, where we are seeing the Chinese government, particularly the national security side of the Chinese government, become more active in targeting this sector for intensive scrutiny and intervention. So I think it's critical for people to keep an eye on this and to understand this kind of firm and government tension as a major market-shaping dynamic in the future.
Let me come back to AI at the end of our conversation, Julian. I want to also talk about President Putin's visit, because as I mentioned in the open, he came to town, I believe it was 4 days after the Americans left, and he did have 40 signed cooperation agreements when he left, and there was a joint declaration signed by President Putin and President Xi to build what they called a multipolar world and a new type of international relations. And we know this is diplomatic jargon for an alternative to the order the United States has built. And then at the signing ceremony, President Xi warned of unilateral and hegemonic countercurrents running rampant. That's quite a phrase. None of this is coincidence. So for investors that are trying to read the strategic signals of the past month, not just the U.S. China summit, and not just the atmospherics, the warm atmospherics of the Trump-Xi summit, what's the net takeaway?
So President Putin's visit is a really interesting counterpoint to what we saw with President Trump in Beijing. At some level, the statements that you just pointed to are nothing new. Beijing has been doing this messaging with Moscow for quite a long period of time now. The newest factor, in a way, is that Beijing is doing that messaging, having established its centrality and autonomy, as I was alluding to earlier, bringing not just the American president to Beijing, but the American president as the crescendo of a period of bringing many of the leaders of the West. Starmer, Merz, and many others have visited China in the first half of this year. So, Beijing is making these points from a position of unprecedented strength and centrality. And then third and finally, it is really remarkable how even in the period since that joint statement that President Xi and President Putin issued in February 2022, right before the invasion of Ukraine.
I remember.
But even in the 4 years since then, Russia is so clearly the junior partner in this relationship now. And the strongest evidence of that is that despite the spate of deals that you alluded to, President Putin did not get his Power of Siberia pipeline, which is in so many ways one of his top asks.
I hear you loud and clear, Julian, not to read this summit in isolation. That Beijing is running multiple bilateral relationships simultaneously. And, I would say they're each calibrated to maximize its own leverage. And that's what we're getting. The way I put it, and you and I have had some exchanges on this recently, I think the U.S. and China have reached escalatory parity. And so escalation parity without a recognition to each other of that fact is mutual self-delusion, and deliberate opacity creates structural instability. What do you make of that argument? And did the summit change anything in this regard if you buy it?
I mean, I think these are such profound points, Daleep, and I think it's underappreciated in both capitals and it's underappreciated, globally. But the core insight that you're just describing of a ability to stalemate or have parity with one another in the economic domain, but a total lack of, coherent or strategic awareness of how to deal with that is a tremendously risky and destabilizing place to be. I think the only place where I might sort of, provocatively push back on your framing is just to say that the idea of escalation dominance or escalation parity often, I think, feels to people like a throwback to the Cold War kind of nuclear architecture, where there was a clear ladder of escalation and the ability to impose mutually assured destruction that ultimately proved stabilizing. But I think the reason that this vision is so destabilizing, and also perhaps why the idea of escalation dominance doesn't fit perfectly, is that there is not a linear or two-dimensional ladder of escalation. We are in a multidimensional, a three-dimensional sort of scenario here, where so much of what causes the ability of each side to stalemate each other and the instability that you describe is because there isn't a clear up and down ladder. It's a series of asymmetric or orthogonal moves that each side can make in relation to the other. And as a result, even when we are in periods of stability, neither side feels any measure of security because they don't know if something's going to come at them from the side, not simply, from head on. And so that I don't mean that in any way actually to be an academic point, because I think for policymakers and for investors, understanding that multidimensionality is actually the kind of orienting place for anticipating how events will unfold in the future, where a tool, for instance, like tariffs has proved to not be tremendously effective vis-a-vis China, but a tool like financial sanctions, I think, still could be very effective if the U.S. government chose to deploy it. Beijing, meanwhile, has a set of choke points of its own that it's seeking to leverage, but of course is also attempting to develop the capability to withstand financial sanctions from the United States. And so again, we're in this multidimensional world without a clear up and down ladder.
It goes back to the question of perception versus reality on both sides. Both sides are capable of misperceiving what's actually happening on the ground. And let me just turn to one final part of the competition, which is arguably the most important, AI. There was a discussion of AI at the summit. President Trump mentioned as much. And Secretary Bessent, he made a revealing comment afterwards. He said, look, U.S. AI leadership is the reason China was willing to talk at all. But here again, the way both sides discussed the AI conversation was very different. The U.S. framed it as a discussion about AI safety, guardrails against nefarious use. The Chinese foreign ministry said it was about AI development. No mention of safety, no mention of security. So same meeting, completely different descriptions. What does that tell you about what each side actually wants from the other on the AI file?
Well, in a way, it's quite sort of transparent from those words. China is hopeful that it can use this kind of interaction to advance its AI progress, whether by lessening U.S. pressure on Chinese AI firms or by getting useful information. And the United States historically has approached these dialogues from a perspective of AI safety. I would say, though, that we are always with these folks in Washington, trying to discern what is lasting and what is temporary. And I think there was a period after the Mythos news where a number of folks in the administration reportedly became quite concerned about AI safety, realizing that the risks that that community has warned about are not simply conjecture for the future, but are here and now. I think as we consider what might be discussed in these future dialogues, I'm happy to go into more detail about how I think they might unfold. But I do think the fundamental question with this administration is, are they treating AI safety as a priority? Or, was that a period of a few weeks with a few players on the ascent? But then we're now in a different timeline, and this is just a lower priority. And the truth is, I don't think any of us yet know.
Let me ask you one more on AI, because there's a conventional framing of the AI competition, which is all about who's developing the best frontier models, who's ahead on leading edge chips. And that may be missing something important, because there's a case that China isn't actually trying to win the frontier race. It's trying to win the diffusion race, deploying AI at scale into manufacturing, into industrial robots, into infrastructure, making it open source, integrating it as fast and as far as they can in the real economy, and basically creating structural advantages that export controls can't touch, which is manufacturing scale and state-level coordination and deployment. Is that a fair read of Beijing's AI strategy?
So this idea has become a real sticky meme, and I'm guilty of contributing to it. About a bit over a year ago, I published an essay in the Financial Times that described these two somewhat distinct races that each side is running: a U.S. fixation on reaching AGI, or ever more capable frontier systems, and a Chinese focus on deployment and diffusion to entrench their manufacturing advantage and their sort of physical AI advantage over the long term. And I do think that is accurate, in a sense, but I think it is also very incomplete and has become more incomplete over the past year. And the stickiness of that meme, I worry, is a little too reassuring to certain communities. China wants it all. They want, of course, naturally, to have the best models in the world if they can. And they also want to have a AI plus paradigm, as they call it in their policymaking discourse, that enables them to, continue to take an even higher percentage of global manufacturing and to have the most compelling robots and drones and all the rest, to apply this across the board. But I don't think we should take too much comfort in the fact that Xi Jinping may personally not be particularly AGI pilled, because a number of the frontier labs certainly are, and they're racing ahead. On the U.S. side, I think candidly, the biggest challenge at the moment is, not a lack of capital, certainly, rushing into these firms and potential, IPOs before the end of the year for a number of the major players, but really is the lack of a cohesive effort to connect what those firms are doing to the national interest in a more meaningful way. And our politics don't make that easy, but it is an impossible situation to maintain indefinitely, where the most powerful capabilities of the United States, in addition to the firms that are driving the growth of the U.S. economy and the U.S. stock market, have a very unclear relationship to the U.S. government, very unclear relationship to advancing U.S. national interests.
I want to say you're not just an historian who's written 3 books about China and a former high-level policymaker. You're also a poet, and you published a collection called You Face My Flag. And there's a line in it, I read it, and it stayed with me. It says, "To use a man for his shadow is to make a thing of him." And, you may have written that about something personal, but I wonder if it doesn't also describe something about how great powers use each other, treating relationships as transactional, managing each other for leverage, never quite seeing the other as they actually are. Does that resonate at all with you in terms of what's unfolding between the U.S. and China?
Yeah, it's well, you're very kind to have read it and to refer to it, and it does resonate, though I confess it was nowhere on my mind when I was writing that poem, which is about a dissident in China and the sort of dynamics around what it means to speak out against the state in the Chinese context. But I do think there's a kind of fundamental quality to U.S. China rivalry that is about not simply misperceptions, which is a story that we know well in international relations, but that is about the desire in each system to use the other to mobilize transformation of one's own system. So we've seen this in American politics, the aspiration to use competition with China to find a new degree of national unity or to mobilize domestic investment. And certainly we worked on a lot of things that were in that vein. And I think that's still a live strain in American discourse. And in China, a longstanding desire to use the United States both as a way to get advanced technology, access to the global economy, but also as a sort of a villain or a bogeyman who, Chinese leaders can instill a degree of discipline into their system or crack down on aspects of their system or mobilize action by saying, these guys are out to get us. We need to do this to keep ourselves secure. And that dynamic, each side trying to use images of the other to be the future, sort of build the future for themselves that they hope for, that dynamic is one that I think we have yet to see how it will lead us, whether it will cause a race to the bottom, a sort of intensified escalation in the period ahead as each side increasingly defines its national identity in stark zero-sum opposition to the other, or if perhaps where this goes in the future is stabilized by clearer or more evolved images of the other, maybe to end on an optimistic note after a somewhat pessimistic conversation. I do think we're at a moment in the United States where the debate on China policy is as broad and open as it has been in decades. And, even if I clearly have my views, I think that's a good thing because I think as a democracy, we are going to be best able to sustain a long-term advantage if we have a maximally pluralistic and open and vibrant society and debate around these issues. And I do think that that's beginning to happen in some ways. So we'll see.
So Julian, let me get you out of here on this. What's the most conventional belief that's held in your world, however you define it, that you think is just flat wrong? It's the question I ask all my guests.
So it's a really interesting question. And on China, there are a lot. But the one that I've been thinking a lot about lately is, we have a conventional idea that the United States may need to be thinking about managing China's decline, aging population, major debt burdens, all the things we were alluding to earlier. But I think the really missed question there, but I think the question that often gets missed there is whether, in fact, what the United States should be preparing for is to manage Xi Jinping. He is going very likely to get another 5-year term next year, 2027. And he's going to be in power as an aging leader of one of the world's most important countries and major economies. And so we think so much about, okay, well, what would it look like if China has a financial crisis, or how are demographics going to drag on China? But I think it's just crucial to think about not just what does it mean for succession, who comes next in China, but for what he does over the next decade. It's a question I'm going to be working on in the period ahead, but I think it's something that we often miss, but is just so important.
I like your answer. Thanks again for joining me.
Great to be with you, Daleep.